Every night, while you sleep, a hormone spike can silently expand your waistline by 3 inches. It's not your thyroid, it's not insulin, it's a stress signal your body evolved to save your life. Now it's backfiring inside your bedroom. One single night of bad sleep can jack that hormone up by nearly 50%. When it surges at the wrong hour, your metabolism flips into a storage mode that makes every calorie stick like contact cement. Most people blame carbs or willpower. The real trap is a biochemical loop that runs between your brain, your adrenal glands, and your belly. If you want the uncensored truth about what really runs your weight, subscribe and let's dissect it. Let's get into it. Meet cortisol. You know it as the stress hormone, but few explain how it secretly hijacks sleep and fat storage in the same 24-hour window. In a healthy cycle, cortisol peaks around 8 a.m. to wake you up, then slides downhill. By 10 p.m., it should be practically asleep itself. But when you are sleep deprived, your brain's command center, the hypothalamus, stops receiving the nightly all-clear signal, so it keeps the stress switch jammed on. Cortisol stays elevated past midnight, falsifying the biological time of day. High nocturnal cortisol tells your liver to dump glucose, blood sugar rises, and your pancreas is forced to over-release insulin. Insulin then locks fat inside your fat cells, especially around the organs. That visceral fat costs the US healthcare system over $100 billion a year. Take Sarah, a 42-year-old marketing exec, averaging 5.5 hours of sleep. Her late-night cortisol cruises 35% above the normal nighttime low. At 3 a.m., her body believes it's in danger, so it ramps up the hunger hormone ghrelin and slashes the satiety signal leptin. By morning, Sarah's brain is screaming for a 600 calorie fix. A sugary latte and a bagel feel non-negotiable. That high-sugar breakfast triggers another cortisol spike. Now she's locked inside the loop. Poor sleep, cortisol. Cravings, more cortisol, worse sleep. Analogy: cortisol is a fire alarm. With chronic sleep loss, the alarm bell is jammed in the on position, day and night. And the fat storage? Think of your body stockpiling emergency supplies because it's convinced a famine is coming, despite a fully stocked pantry. This loop doesn't just add weight, it shifts where the weight lands. Cortisol receptors are densest in deep belly fat cells. Even if Sarah's calories stayed identical, a 30% cortisol surplus reroutes more energy to the waistline. She loses lean mass too. Here's the self-reinforcing trap. Visceral fat starts secreting inflammatory signals that tell the brain we're under attack. The brain answers by raising cortisol even higher. A vicious cycle. More belly fat generates more stress signal. The final gear: high cortisol fragments, deep, slow-wave sleep. The exact stage your metabolism needs to repair itself. You wake up exhausted, reach for caffeine, which constricts vessels and prolongs the cortisol flood. The loop tightens another notch. Breaking it requires hitting multiple switches at once. 5 minutes of meditation without fixing sleep timing barely makes a dent. First lever: reset your cortisol clock with 10 minutes of morning sunlight before 8 a.m. Retinal light calibrates the entire 24-hour rhythm. Second lever: a strict light curfew after 10 p.m. Blue light from screens tricks the brain into thinking it's still noon. Third lever: the 3-2-1 rule. No calories 3 hours before bed, no fluids 2 hours, no screens 1 hour. That sequence can flatten the midnight cortisol peak. And here's the precise payoff. When you sync that late night cortisol, ghrelin drops, deep sleep rebounds, and your belly fat starts to release its grip. Like, if you want metabolism science without the myths, comment one change you'll try tonight. Subscribe next, we reveal the mineral that acts as a natural cortisol dimmer switch. Here's exactly how that 3:15 a.m. jolt starts. A midnight cortisol microspike of just 22 micrograms per deciliter triggers a full liver glucose dump within 90 seconds. Think of cortisol like a faulty smoke alarm wired directly to your pancreas. It screams fire when the only flame is a stressful email from yesterday. That glucose flood spikes your blood sugar to 140 milligrams per deciliter while you're still asleep, forcing your pancreas to release an emergency insulin surge. Insulin then overshoots, crashing your glucose down to 65 by 3:45 a.m. Your brain reads that as a survival threat and jolts you awake with a racing heart. This single nocturnal cycle slashes your slow-wave deep sleep by up to 40 minutes, the exact phase where your body burns stored fat. Less deep sleep means your pituitary gland secretes nearly 60% less growth hormone that night, the main repair and fat-mobilizing signal. Over 6 months, that nightly growth hormone deficit eats away lean muscle mass. Sarah lost 4 pounds of muscle just from her thighs and back. Every pound of lost muscle lowers her resting metabolic rate by 8 calories per day. That means she now burns 32 fewer calories at rest every single night. Meanwhile, cortisol itself activates lipoprotein lipase inside her visceral fat cells, literally plucking fatty acids from her bloodstream and locking them into belly fat. This creates a closed loop. Fragmented sleep raises cortisol, which stores visceral fat, which narrows her airway, which fragments sleep even more. Sarah's numbers hit hard: 15 pounds gained in 6 months, waist circumference up 4 inches, all while eating the same 1,800 calories a day. She spent $800 on sleep trackers and $600 on pre-portioned meals. The bathroom scale still climbed every Monday morning. The missing mechanism was timing. Her master clock wasn't getting a morning reset, so her cortisol rhythm stayed flattened by 32%. Specialized retinal cells catch morning blue light and fire a signal directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which orders a robust cortisol rise by 7 a.m. Sarah's routine, waking under dim LEDs and staying indoors until 10 a.m., delayed that peak by 3 hours, squashing her natural nighttime cortisol dip. A blunted morning peak creates a higher midnight trough. Instead of dropping to under 5 micrograms per deciliter at 11 p.m., her cortisol stayed at 14. It's like a thermostat that only kicks on at noon. The furnace runs when you're supposed to be cooling down, burning your sleep into a sweaty, anxious mess. The 1 cent fix: 10 minutes of outdoor light in the first 30 minutes after waking resets the axis and pulls the cortisol peak forward by over an hour. After 3 mornings of doing this, Sarah's 3:15 a.m. awakenings stopped cold. Her deep sleep rebounded by 35 minutes the very next week. But the weight kept sticking because a second cortisol lever remained untouched, late night blue light sabotaging her melatonin onset. Scrolling her phone until 11:55 p.m. blasted her retina with 480 nanometer light, suppressing her pineal melatonin output by over 50% within 15 minutes. That melatonin delay pushes sleep onset past midnight and raises the late evening cortisol slope, adding another 7 micrograms per deciliter to her midnight level. Now, the hunger hormone ghrelin gets yanked into the loop. Elevated evening cortisol stimulates ghrelin release within 45 minutes. Simultaneously, cortisol upregulates neuropeptide Y in the brain, flipping a primitive switch that screams for high sugar, high fat foods, not carrot sticks. Sarah found herself spoon deep in a $7 pint of butter pecan at 11:20 p.m., adding 430 calories her body had zero plan to burn while sleeping. Those calories hit her bloodstream when insulin sensitivity is at its lowest point of the day, shunting over 60% directly into visceral fat storage. That new belly fat secretes interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha, inflammatory cytokines that travel to her brain and further shred deep sleep architecture. Her doctor's warning cut through an A1C of 5.8 and a projected $15,000 extra lifetime healthcare cost if the loop didn't break within 12 months. Sarah stacked 3 $0 moves, 10 minutes of morning sun, amber glasses by 9 p.m., and a 12-minute diaphragmatic breathing wind down. Next, the exact 4-step evening protocol that dropped her midnight cortisol by 40% in 7 days without a single supplement. Blue light from your phone at 11 p.m. doesn't just block melatonin, it directly signals your adrenals to pump cortisol, tricking your body into daytime mode. That late-night cortisol surge delays the natural buildup of adenosine, the sleep pressure chemical, so you don't feel sleepy until well past midnight. Even when you finally drift off, the lingering cortisol fragments deep slow-wave sleep, the restorative phase that repairs your gut lining. Less deep sleep means less growth hormone release, and that directly weakens your intestinal barrier, allowing bacterial fragments to leak into circulation. Those bacterial endotoxins trigger immune cells to fire off inflammatory cytokines, which travel to the brain and crank up the cortisol dial again before you wake. You wake with a morning cortisol that's already too high, feeling exhausted and wired, a perfect setup for a 10 a.m. pastry craving. Here's the mechanism. Elevated cortisol blunts the receptor for leptin, your I'm full signal, while amplifying ghrelin, the feed me hormone. So you reach for a 600 calorie blueberry muffin, spiking insulin and cortisol plus insulin together lock fat into your belly, not your muscles. At the molecular level, cortisol and insulin upregulate lipoprotein lipase inside visceral fat cells, literally pulling fat out of your bloodstream and stuffing it around your organs. And the cruel twist, that visceral fat acts as a local cortisol factory. An enzyme inside it, 11-beta-HSD1, converts inactive cortisol into active cortisol right in the fat tissue. This locally made cortisol then tells the liver to pump out more glucose and makes muscle cells resistant to insulin, trapping energy as more belly fat. Meanwhile, in your brain, insulin resistance dampens dopamine transmission, meaning you need twice as much sugar to feel the same reward, fueling a subconscious addiction loop. At night, high cortisol from the day's stress keeps your sympathetic nervous system buzzing, shortens total sleep time, and primes you for a late evening pantry raid. Physiologically, just one night of poor sleep can boost next day calorie intake by up to 500 extra calories, mostly from ultra-processed snacks high in fat and refined carbs. Those extra calories, consumed at 10 p.m, spike blood sugar and trigger an insulin surge exactly when your melatonin should be rising, pushing your sleep clock further forward. High nocturnal insulin directly suppresses slow-wave sleep by altering how your brain uses glucose. A single late-night sugary snack can erase an hour of deep, restorative sleep. So the vicious loop: daytime stress, evening cortisol elevation, fragmented sleep, ghrelin dominance, low belly fat, local cortisol regeneration, deeper sleep disruption. But you can snap this loop at a precise point by normalizing your evening cortisol curve. The single most potent reset is early morning light exposure. Morning sunlight, within 30 minutes of waking, fires up your suprachiasmatic nucleus, setting the clock so melatonin rises 14-16 hours later, and cortisol peaks early, then plummets by bedtime. With that early morning cortisol surge, you get alertness when you need it, then a steady drop that waves a green flag for sleep. Skip morning light, and your cortisol rhythm flattens and shifts later, making you vulnerable to those sneaky evening spikes. A 15-minute walk before 9 a.m. can reverse this trajectory. The next lever: time-restricted eating. Finish your last bite by 7 p.m. Eating late forces insulin and cortisol to crosstalk when they should be silent, delaying sleep and promoting fat storage. Shifting the bulk of your calories earlier in the day naturally lowers evening cortisol and boosts overnight fat oxidation, even when total calories are identical. Then, a simple light intervention: dim your home lights to warm amber tones 2 hours before bed. This reduces sympathetic outflow and lets your cortisol rhythm descend without interference. Add a 5-minute parasympathetic breath practice: inhale for 4 seconds, exhale for 6, and you directly dampen the amygdala, lowering cortisol in real time and transitioning you into rest and digest mode. Banish intense evening workouts, but a gentle 20-minute walk after dinner blunts the post-meal glucose surge and reduces bedtime cortisol, helping sleep arrive faster. Now link this to the gut microbiome. Sleep loss disrupts your microbial community within 24 hours, reducing diversity and shifting it toward a pattern that extracts more calories from food, the same pattern seen in obesity. A healthy microbiome produces butyrate, which seals the gut, reduces inflammation, and sends calming signals to the brain, dampening the HPA stress response. Breaking the cortisol loop repairs both. Consider the American shift worker. Their risk of metabolic syndrome doubles. But even a 9-to-5 desk worker with chronic low-grade stress and late-night scrolling is caught in the same silent metabolic trap. Yet all these strategies crumble if one overlooked factor: your bedroom temperature isn't dialed in precisely. A thermostat is a direct neuroendocrine switch for cortisol and sleep. We'll crack it open next. Cortisol doesn't just add pounds, it directs fat straight to your belly by activating an enzyme called 11-beta HSD1 inside visceral fat cells. This enzyme converts inactive cortisol into active cortisol right at the fat depot, creating a self-amplifying factory that ignores overall blood levels. Meanwhile, deep sleep normally surges growth hormone, which unlocks stored fat. Cut that surge by just one restless night, and belly fat stays locked. Sleep fragmentation also pumps evening cortisol higher, which then eats away at slow-wave sleep, the very stage that keeps the hormone in check. Think of it like a thermostat with a broken sensor. Your body heats up cortisol at 10 p.m. instead of winding down, so you feel wired but exhausted. That evening cortisol spike blunts the natural melatonin rise by up to 50%, turning your bedroom into a battle zone between alert and asleep chemicals. Even worse, chronic high cortisol flattens the morning cortisol awakening response, so you wake up flat and crave sugar just to feel functional. Now meet Mike, 45, a project manager pulling late nights. His 3-inch waist gain over 18 months wasn't from calories alone, it was this loop. Mike's circadian rhythm had shifted, cortisol peaked at midnight instead of 6 a.m, and his deep sleep shrank to 12 minutes a night. Without deep sleep, his body produced 30% less leptin the next day, so his brain read famine even though he'd eaten dinner. Sleep loss also took a direct hit on his glucose metabolism. Just 4 hours of sleep for 6 days slashed his insulin sensitivity by 40%, trapping energy in his blood. That rising insulin then fed back into the loop. High insulin at night disrupts the brain's clearance of orexin, causing more awakenings. Now Mike's visceral fat is cranking out its own inflammatory signals, IL-6 and TNF-alpha, which further stimulate the adrenal glands to release cortisol. This is a closed loop. Belly fat inflammation, poor sleep, more belly fat. Breaking it requires targeting all 3 corners simultaneously. First corner, re-anchor the cortisol clock. Morning light hits special retinal cells called iPRGCs, which tell the suprachiasmatic nucleus to set a firm cortisol peak by 8 a.m, just 10 minutes outdoors before 9 a.m, without sunglasses, can shift the cortisol curve forward by an hour within 3 days. At night, the same light sensor needs darkness. Even a 10 lux glow from a phone keeps cortisol from retreating, blocking the melatonin onset by 90 minutes. Second corner, reduce the neural overdrive. The vagus nerve dials down cortisol via the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway, but it needs deliberate stimulation. Mike started 5-minute resonant breathing exercises before bed, 5.5 seconds in, 5.5 seconds out, which boosted his heart rate variability and lowered nighttime cortisol by 15% within weeks. This isn't relaxation fluff, it's a mechanical break. Slowing the breath to 5.5 cycles per minute entrains the barrow reflex, physically signaling safety to the hypothalamus. Third corner, strategic nutrition timing. Carbohydrates eaten at dinner raise serotonin, which builds melatonin, but Mike's late night eating had hijacked that pathway. He shifted his calories earlier, finishing his last meal by 7 p.m, and dropped his 24-hour cortisol output by aligning insulin and cortisol rhythms. His fasting window extended to 13 hours naturally, which boosted adiponectin, a hormone that tells visceral fat to stop clinging to the abdomen. But here's what often gets missed. Belly fat aromatizes testosterone into estradiol, and elevated estradiol can sensitize the HPA axis, amplifying the stress loop further. So Mike's doctor checked both his midnight salivary cortisol and his estradiol. Correcting one without the other would only dent the cycle. After 8 weeks of morning sunlight, a 7 p.m. meal cutoff, and 10 minutes of paced breathing, Mike's waist shrank 3.5 inches and his deep sleep rebounded to 65 minutes. His midnight cortisol dropped from 0.6 microGDL to 0.15, and the stubborn fog that used to hit at 3 p.m. evaporated because his cortisol curve was finally steep in the morning. Notice the sequence. None of this was about eating less or exercising more. It was about dismantling the biochemical architecture that made his body store fat. The loop can also run in reverse. One night of ultra-deep sleep can lower evening cortisol enough that the next day you naturally choose protein over a bagel. That's the leverage point most weight loss advice misses. You don't fight cravings with willpower, you starve them of the hormonal trigger that sparks them at dusk. Picture a high-stakes day that ends with a racing mind at 10 p.m. That late-night mental buzz is cortisol still surging when it should be bottoming out. To slip into restorative sleep, your brain needs a clean handoff from cortisol to melatonin, and that only happens if cortisol drops low enough. That low watermark is roughly 3 micrograms per deciliter. Stay above it, and the sleep switch gets stuck off. High evening cortisol directly suppresses the pineal gland, choking off melatonin release like a kinked garden hose. Think of cortisol as the nightclub bouncer who refuses to unclip the velvet rope. Melatonin can't get in to start the show. You're left in a shallow, twitchy semi-sleep with a resting heart rate that's 8 to 12 beats too fast. That robs you of slow-wave deep sleep, the exact phase when your brain flushes metabolic waste and your body repairs insulin receptors. Without deep sleep, the pituitary gland slashes its nighttime pulse of growth hormone by up to 70%. Growth hormone is your body's night shift cleanup crew. It mobilizes stored fat and regenerates lean tissue while you sleep. So a single bad night doesn't just make you groggy, it dials down your overnight fat-burning furnace. Morning arrives and the poor sleep has left your cortisol curve wrecked. It spikes even higher to get you upright, then stays elevated. That prolonged morning cortisol makes the primitive survival brain scream for the fastest available fuel, sugar and fat together. Here's the mechanism. Cortisol boosts ghrelin, the hunger signal, while simultaneously suppressing leptin, the stop-eating hormone. Sleep deprivation can pump ghrelin up by roughly 15% and push leptin down by over 15%, a double-stuffed craving cookie. Suddenly that office donut or 11 p.m. bowl of cereal feels biologically irresistible, not just a willpower fail. Meanwhile, the cortisol spike reduces your cell's sensitivity to insulin, so every carb you eat is more likely to be stored than burned. And where does that storage happen? Visceral fat cells have 4 times the cortisol receptors, and an enzyme called 11-beta-HSD1 that reactivates cortisol locally. That means the belly fat itself becomes a cortisol factory, amplifying the stress signal right where it sits. You've got a self-sustaining loop. Stress disturbs sleep, sleep loss deposits belly fat sends more stress signals to the brain. It's like a thermostat stuck on heat while a window's wide open. The system keeps pumping out cortisol, but the room never warms up, so it runs harder. Over months, this loop hardwires into metabolic syndrome, high fasting glucose, a thickening waist, and chronic exhaustion. That's why the old eat less, move more script fails. It treats a hormonal trap as a simple calorie math problem. To break the loop, you don't start with the gym or the diet. You start by rebuilding the evening cortisol collapse. Cortisol timing is largely set by 2 ancient signals: light entering your eyes and your core body temperature rhythm. Getting 10 minutes of outdoor morning light before 9 a.m. anchors a healthy cortisol curve. It naturally tanks at night like a stone. At the other end, a dim, amber-lit environment after 9 p.m. tells the master clock it's time to power down the stress axis. A clinical trick: schedule a 15-minute worry window of 5 p.m. to drain the mental inventory so it doesn't hijack your pillow time. Once the nightly cortisol drop returns, deep sleep rebounds, ghrelin quiets down, and insulin sensitivity can improve within days. That local belly fat enzyme, 11-beta-HSD1, gets the message to stand down, and the visceral stress factory starts to shrink. Your metabolism isn't broken, it's trapped in a self-defense loop, and the reset button is hiding in your next night's cortisol crash. The fastest way to snap that cortisol loop is something you already have: your eyes and the morning sky. When 100,000 lux of outdoor light hits your melanopsin cells before 8 a.m., your SCN fires a cortisol pulse that programs your 15-hour timer for melatonin release that night. No morning light, and your evening cortisol stays 30-40% higher, which robs you of the first deep sleep cycle where growth hormone actually mobilizes belly fat. My patient Mark had a resting heart rate of 81 at 3 a.m. and a waistline stuck at 42 inches after 6 months of keto. We didn't cut a single calorie. We moved his HIIT to 7 a.m., added 10 minutes of zone 2 walking after dinner, and taught him a 4-second inhale for bedtime parasympathetic reset. The post-dinner walk shunts 20-30% of postprandial glucose straight into working muscle, so his pancreas doesn't have to flood the system with enough insulin to wake his brain at 2 a.m. And that nasal-only 4-second inhale, it activates mechanoreceptors in the lower lungs that feed straight into the vagus nerve, dropping heart rate variability into high parasympathetic tone in under 90 seconds. Without that shift, his midnight cortisol spike kept fragmenting stage N3 sleep, the only window where your brain's glymphatic system clears the metabolic waste that drives next-day cravings. 3 weeks later, Mark's resting heart rate had dropped to 67, his sleep efficiency hit 92%, and his fasting glucose fell from 108 to 91 mg/dl. His waist, it went from 42 to 39.5 inches without a single gram of carb fear. We didn't starve his body, we taught it when it was safe to burn. Because visceral fat isn't a calorie problem first, it's a biological signal that your nervous system hasn't gotten the memo, the threat's over, you can release the tire. You don't fix the cortisol weight loop by stressing less, you break it by giving your brain's master clock 3 precise anchors it cannot misinterpret: morning light, post-meal movement, and a deliberate exhale before sleep. If this gave you a new lens on fat loss, hit like so YouTube knows real physiology still matters. Then tell me below, which anchor will you lock in first? The 10-minute outside walk before 8:30 a.m. or the post-dinner stroll? Subscribe and I'll see you next time, where I reveal why your steel-cut oatmeal breakfast is triggering a bigger insulin storm than a glazed donut.